this business of human rights and whether the Russian authorities are really being pressed to do all they can. Are they?
I don't think they are being pressed to do all they can. I think it's very imperative at this moment to shift the burden from the very brave human rights activists on the ground and the journalists who were recording abuses to the policymakers, both in the Kremlin, but also in the United States and in the European Union. If the US and the EU together have one voice on this, I think it will have more of an impact in encouraging President Medvedev to address these issues.
Now, one of the things you've written is that, in fact, Western policymakers don't seem to have any idea how to do this, and particularly because most of it springs from the problem and the violence in the North Caucasus, particularly in Chechnya.
That's right. There's been a tremendous spike in the summer of 2009 in violence in the North Caucasus, but for over 10 years it's been an issue that's really dogged administrations in the United States. And I think we're so focused on a conversation about counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. What you're seeing in the North Caucasus in many ways is bad coin. It's bad counterinsurgency. And for that reason, it's a security issue for Europe and for the United States, as well as obviously for Russia.
I want to talk about the civil society meeting that went on in Moscow that Hillary Clinton went to. I believe both Tom and you were involved in a civil society group over the summer.
That's right.
And we've got this Wordle thing, which makes a word cloud of words that are used in various speeches. And so the one that is representative of what happened in Moscow, it does mention things like accountable, governance, human and rights. There are maybe about 3 mentions, but not a huge number. You have been in touch with your colleagues out there. Are you pleased with the tone that Secretary Clinton took?
Well, Secretary Clinton really had 3 opportunities to engage human rights and civil society. One was a meeting at Spaso House, the ambassador's residence. One was on a progressive radio station. And one was to students at Moscow State University. And in every case, she talked about the impunity, the culture of impunity, that these journalists and human rights activists are under siege. I think that's very important. But we really want to see, I think, eventually as a whole package of ways in which the Obama administration is making this a critical component of how they engage Russia and Russians. And I think there's a role for my colleague Tom and I to play in that, and others as well.
So Tom, what is, Tom Malinowski in Washington of Human Rights Watch, what is the advice to the Obama administration of keeping to the very committed rhetoric that certainly was floated during the campaign for the presidency, the human rights rhetoric?
Well, the president has continued that rhetoric, actually, in the speeches that he's given around the world, in Egypt, in Moscow when he was there, over the summer, in Ghana, and most recently speaking to the UN General Assembly. But there's sometimes a tension between the extraordinarily powerful convictions that he has expressed and the equally strong desire, an understandable desire of the administration to rebuild America's diplomatic relationships around the world that were frayed during the Bush administration. And I think
building those diplomatic relationships are obviously something that everybody can agree with is vitally important. But let's take a few issues here where perhaps there's a collision between that and some of the human rights promises. Let's take Burma, the idea that the administration wants to engage with Burma. The military junta still has Aung San Suu Kyi in prison. Let's take China, where we already mentioned that Secretary Clinton seemed to push human rights aside in favor of the much more pragmatic engagement on the economy, nuclear proliferation, climate change. Let's even take Sudan, which is run now by a president who's the only sitting head of state indicted by the War Crimes Tribunal. What is the administration getting in return? I mean, this seems to be a pattern. Why in these countries is engagement being touted without a return?
Burma is one I think they've gotten the balance right. Engagement, all engagement really means is that you talk to governments, and that shouldn't be controversial. They've maintained sanctions on Burma. They've maintained the paramount goal of freeing political prisoners and moving towards democracy. China, I think, is a different matter, and that's where we've seen the tension play out in the most acute way, with several signals that have been sent suggesting that the administration is putting human rights issues to one side. And most recently, the, I think, symbolic mistake of the president declining to meet the Dalai Lama before his own visit to China later next month. I think if you were to ask President Obama about this, he'd say, you know, what matters is it's not the symbolic events and the statements that I make, it's the substance of what I can achieve on the issue of Tibet, for example. But I think symbolism matters tremendously, and I think that symbolism sent a message to the Chinese government that perhaps this isn't as high a priority for the United States as it has been in the past.
You're nodding your head, Sarah. Symbolism matters?
Symbolism does matter. I mean, if it were up to me, I would have preferred Secretary Clinton to meet the human rights activists on their turf, that is, to go to Memorial or maybe the Sakharov Museum in Moscow. But I think it's very important to recognize it is in the U.S. national security interest and the Obama administration's interest to have these countries, whether it's China or Russia, be ruled by law and be compliant and be reliable partners. And what you see happening for sure in Russia is this culture of impunity really, it calls into question our ability to do things together that are in our national security interest.